up, guys? Welcome back to the Levers podcast. I'm Tej. I'm here with my usual co-conspirators, Lil Hack and Shake. And today we're going to be talking about order without design. This is sort of a mental model, if you will, but traditionally talked about in the context of urban design. So it's based on a book of its namesake by Alain Bertrand. And it basically talks about two competing approaches to a city's growth. So one is the kind of top-down planned approach, which says that the city bureaucrats and the city planners take a look at the city. They try to make a projection about what the city needs, what the people, businesses, and enterprise need, and they build those things into the city. This is urban planning, like Corbusier, if you're familiar. And the other side is the idea of order without design. The idea that that sort of planning from a very high level is a bit arrogant because you can't possibly know what the collective desires and goals and needs of the city's inhabitants are. So instead, you take a step back, you create good rules and structure, for example, public transport and delineation between public and private land. And then you let the city build and grow itself in an iterative way where it sometimes fails, sometimes succeeds, but either way is free to do so. So it's sort of a hands-off approach. And while this is relevant to urban design, you can think about it more broadly, right? It is often arrogant and an oversight to try to plan too far in the future or too widely in terms of the breadth of your activity or behavior. And instead, you can take the approach that you got to remain humble. You don't know what the next month or year, what will ensue during it. And so instead, you go in with an open mind and you try things and you tinker, you lean in, you meet new people, you try some new initiatives. And out of that tinkering comes a sense of order that gives you sort of productivity that would exceed had you gone way back to the beginning and tried to plan everything from scratch. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today with the Levered Lads.
Yeah, so since the Order Without Design book inspired this conversation, I thought we'd kick it off with a little rant about what our favorite cities are, since it kind of captures the idea pretty well. So, boys, you've traveled a little bit. Where are some places that you've really loved?
Shake, give her a go, baby.
Rio de Janeiro, I think.
And what you studied abroad there, right?
I studied abroad in Sao Paulo, but yeah, Rio definitely doesn't have much order at all. I mean, it's very like haphazardly. It's same with Sao Paulo actually. Like the cities both kind of grew too fast for anyone to plan anything. So they just lack a lot of infrastructure, and like Rio's famous for the really expensive like beach resorts on Copacabana. They have these favelas like immediately right behind it. And so when I was there, we didn't stay at the nice resorts, but when we were on the beach, like a kid actually came and stole my cell phone and we had to chase him down and stuff. So it's pretty crazy. And he got scared, so he got scared, so he just threw it up in the air back at me.
Did you catch it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's unreal.
It was like something out of a movie. Like he came up and he was like, "Can I have some of your drink?" And I was like, "No, dude, like you're like 12 years old." And I was drinking alcohol, and he just kept getting closer. He's like, "Oh, come on, man!" He just grabbed my phone and he started running. It's crazy.
So if it was like kind of just like a crazy place, like what made you like it so much? Like some people wouldn't want their phones being stolen.
12-year-olds.
That's good vol. That's deep vol.
Playing football with your cell phone.
What made me like it so much? I mean, it kind of felt like so I would say Sao Paulo felt like the New York City of Brazil, and Rio felt like the LA of Brazil. It's right next to the beach, and it's hard to explain why I liked it. I mean, it had a lot of cool attractions, I guess. That's where like the famous Cristo, the Redeemer, is. That big statue where he has his arms out, and they have some crazy architecture there, but really it had like a lot of like it had a lot of life there. It felt very like a vibrant city. You know, in Brazil, people are always like sitting out, like drinking beers or just eating out in these little cafes, and everyone's very social, and I like that about it.
Dude, Rio's actually is such a topical drop for this pod because
Tropical
in a lot of
drop?
these topical and tropical drop. In a lot of these books that talk about order without design and like the informal sector of economies and real estate, like the favela ecosystem is like the first plug because it's just like these like vast shanty towns, which like there are no property rights, like you can't get a mortgage from a bank on them, right? Like the government's not going to defend your property rights, but people organize these informal sectors of like corrugated iron shanties, and there are rules and laws built into how those people cooperate. Like rent is often collected on time, and if you don't pay rent, you're just removed from your home by like a violent cabal that does the law enforcement for that area. This is all extrajudicial, right?
Yeah.
The favelas are like a very interesting outgrowth.
Yeah.
It's like it just like gets to the comparison between like those cities evolving as if they were biological organisms, right? Like they evolve these systems, and these systems work outside the traditional information sector, and that's kind of just that. People are going to do it. I mean, you don't need to sit, in your ivory tower and tell them what to do. They're going to do it either way.
Yeah. Yeah, dude, if anyone if you guys are interested or anyone's interested, there's a movie called Elite Squad. And a lot of people have probably seen this movie. It's called City of God. It's like one of the most famous Brazilian movies. But Elite Squad is like much more like action, violent kind of thing, but it's all about favelas and how in favelas, like the police oftentimes are afraid to go into the worst, like they don't even go in, they don't even go into the worst favelas because it's basically run by gangs. It's really wild.
Well, a lot of people dislike the favelas, or like they don't like what they stand for. But then um, there's always the example. Is it Brasilia? Basically, the like top-down planned um, urban area that was just way out in the middle of nowhere, and it was like they made it from complete scratch, but no one ended up living there.
It
Yeah.
was designed to be the capital, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they always contrast the favelas with Brasilia because, like, um, basically, it seems like the favelas are bad because it's like poverty relative to Western countries. But for them, it's better than the top-down planned um, urban area, which basically, like, from the planner's mind, it would be way better. But just based on where it's located, it's away from all the jobs, so no one ends up actually moving there, and it's just impractical. And that kind of dichotomy captures the bottom up versus top down process, and why top down processes often fail.
I mean, an extension of that is um,
It's Brasilia.
oh,
Like it's exactly what you're saying, right? It's like this is like you can totally see some, you know, city planner guy like, oh, this is going to be perfectly symmetrical and stuff, and it
I
is
mean,
beautiful, but no.
this is it is beautiful, but in like a very, very organized, unnatural way. Like, it's just beautiful because it's clean, right?
Yeah.
This reminds me a lot of so like Corbusier, who is like he's like the figurehead of this top-down urban planning narrative. He was a Swiss architect, and he designed the city. Like this is like his magnum opus was the city in India called Chandigarh, and he designed it to be like immaculate, perfectly organized, planned city with beautiful residential, like government buildings over here, certain sectors for certain activities, right? All planned. When you go there now, I think it was built in like the 50s. I can't remember exactly. When you go there now, like all of the stuff of value, like all of the culture of the city, all of the craftsmanship, like the best espresso and the best teas, all of that stuff, it's fascinating. It has all migrated to the informal slums that sit next to the government buildings. Nothing you want of value. There's no mixing in the big buildings, right? They're just like these empty edifices that were built for a purpose that didn't end up playing out. I think you see that with the favelas. You see that with the Brasilia, Sao Paulo, Rio example. It like happens time and time again. Like these planners do not anticipate what's needed, or they very rarely do. I'll say. To answer the question, my favorite city is cities, I guess, Mexico City and Istanbul. I think Mexico City is like a brilliant example of just unfettered growth. It's just like it's kind of like LA, except LA has a lot of, I think, urban planning policies. It's just like this vast outgrowth, just like it's like a teeming like termite hill. Just it's unthinkably large, and you have all these informal settlements and all these like micro neighborhoods, which is sweet. And I like Istanbul because Istanbul is it's like a little bit of a cliche, but it's the bridge from east to west. It's the only large city that straddles two continents, and that kind of like explains the whole story. Like it's a cliche, but it's accurate. It's a crazy enigmatic place. You'll see a mosque with like pious Muslims on their knees right next to a club, with like young lads and girls cranking beers, doing drugs, just like perfect clash, east and west. I've never seen anything like it. So that's me.
Yeah, I'd agree with the Mexico City part partially because we went there, but I think the main reason and why I like the cities I like is for the energy and kind of the diversity and architecture and environments that you walk into. You can tell that it's like been an evolutionary process where things are popping up seemingly random, but then when it ends up being sustainable sticks around, and that's why you get this kind of like rainforest type ecosystem vibe in cities with a lot of energy versus if you go to a suburb in big American cities, they're very sterile. They've been planned. Like there's just not a lot of life going on there, and if there is life, it's because people have kind of just like broke out of how it was planned to be. So I definitely like the aesthetic of spontaneity and just kind of locally emergent behavior. Anytime you use the word emergent, you got to move your hands. I guess if they're listening to the podcast, they can't see that.
Have you guys, Chris, Shake, have you been to Greenwich Village or Washington Square Park?
Yes.
So in the 60s, Robert Moses, who's like a classic urban planning revitalizer type, he wanted to build a causeway. He wanted to revitalize Greenwich Village and build a causeway through that park. And like looking back, that sort of like planning would have been so devastating for that neighborhood. Like that neighborhood's very dear to my heart. It's where I lived for 2 years with a friend of mine. You guys have both been there. Like it's one of these parks. It's on some list in everyone's mind about like some of the greatest parks in the world. It's just like has this unique energy. Like there's all kinds of cats in there. There's a dude who just like plays the piano, rolls his piano into the park every single day. How does he get the piano? No one knows. How does he transport the piano? No one knows. But like all this sort of behavior that happens in the park, it's just like this perfect, this melting pot that's just had years and years of history. But had the urban planner, had the top-down architect been able to do his thing, it might look nothing like it has today. There'd be a causeway literally severing Greenwich Village, severing downtown from Midtown. But instead, we got this beautiful growth.
Yeah, that is a good example. Yeah, it's funny that all of us, I didn't even think of choosing a favorite city that kind of lined up with some of the principles of the books that you mentioned, and but it's funny how that works. It is evolutionary, and it's like a natural, organic almost process of a city, a beautiful city growing.
By the way, I should say I feel like I gave short shrift to Jane Jacobs here, but Jane Jacobs was responsible for fighting off Robert Moses and his acolytes. She like drummed up an urban like a group of like urban defenders to fight off that movement. And her whole shtick was she believed that cities grow organically, and for a vibrant city, like she describes Greenwich Village as vibrant for a very particular reason, which I think is accurate and sort of a unique viewpoint. It says that like a vibrant part of a city requires that different types of people use it for different reasons at different times throughout the day. And so it sounds like sort of maybe complicated, maybe cliche, I don't know, but the idea is good. Like if you have a neighborhood like FIDI, downtown Manhattan, all that happens there is commerce, right? It's just big glitzy buildings, commerce happens. So from 8 to 5, people are using that area of the city and it's vibrant. The rest of the time it's dead because no one lives there, no one plays there, right? So it's just work 8 to 5 and then it's done. So there's no natural mixing. You go to Greenwich Village has some of the offices downtown, it has some parks, it has a lot of restaurants and bars, and it has a lot of apartments. So you have 4 different types of uses, so 4 different types of users, and because of those variety of uses, you have people moving in and out of that area all day. So it gives this like sort of constant energy to the area that just begets more energy. And I think it's sort of an interesting idea. If you let things evolve like that, people will naturally associate in those ways. And then you throw kind of a flywheel into effect. Had Robert Moses come in the 60s, that flywheel wouldn't have had the interluding 50 years to do his thing.
Yeah, and the order without design comes from actually Hayek, who is like an Austrian economist, and his whole shtick, or part of one of his shticks, was that basically the reason top-down planning doesn't work is a top-down planner can't have all the information they need to plan the economy. And how that kind of extends to this, urban planning is there's no one smart enough to say, oh, I need to plan for these 4 groups of people and I need to schedule them in at these times a day and I need to build everything in such a way that, the work people will be here at the right time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's the reason that the top-down planning ends up failing is that you just can't get people smart enough to foresee how everything should work in a complex ecosystem, and I think that's kind of the tricky part about this whole topic is you kind of to agree with the bottom up order, you have to acknowledge that we have limited ability to reason and plan, and even if we try our best, it's not going to do as well as kind of the market and the people, which I think that's cool. It's borderline spiritual. Like you're putting your faith in just like this ecosystem of people to arrive at a sustainable solution. But we've kind of been, taught that that's impossible, or the way school works with like it's very hierarchical and there's a top-down plan and curriculum. So I think we don't necessarily get taught about how markets and ecosystems work.
Yes,
Yeah, dude,
it's really interesting.
Robert Moses was, he's sort of he's a double-edged sword because like he was in a lot of ways a visionary, right? Like so this book, Future and Its Enemies by Virginia Pastoral, I think in a lot of ways it's an extension of Order Without Design. So the dynamists are those who pursue order without design, bottom up, and then the statists are the one who sort of want to keep things the same and or project and guide where things are going. So Robert Moses, he's sort of not a statist in that he has these big revolutionary, visionary ideas about revitalizing neighborhood. He wants to change shit, right? So he's more like active and intrepid than a statist. But at the very same time, like he had some very, very arrogant ideas. Like for example, the causeway going through Greenwich Village, just assuming he knew what was best for an entire neighborhood, understanding all of the individual decisions and needs of all of the individual people and communities interacting in that neighborhood. Arrogant and excessive. Another thing that my mom told me is on Long Island, where she grew up, they designed a series of beaches for people from the city to go relax on. And I'm not going to get this quite right, but Robert Moses effectively designed it such that the beaches were so far away that in order to access the beaches, this is the early 60s. So we're talking about like peak civil rights, where New York was coming along, but there was still racist undertones, at least restrictive. The beaches were built so far away that you had to have access to a public bus to get there. And the public buses that went out there were inherently more accessible by white passengers. So there's a lot of Robert Moses stuff going on that's really not quite so great.
Yeah. And Jane Jacobs, she wasn't a city planner, right?
Jane Jacobs,
What was her background?
I mean, she was a community organizer. She was a writer and a community organizer and a mother. I mean,
She definitely wasn't like a PhD in urban planning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting with this is it definitely applies at this big societal level, but it also like it interacts at the personal level. So there's like the Chinese concept of wu wei, which I think loosely translates to like inaction, um, and it's kind of this idea of a lot of our solutions, come from coming up with a plan, like being very proactive, fixing everything. Um, where Wu Wei is like kind of letting things around you happen and letting solutions emerge naturally. And I think there's kind of an analog there where sometimes in your personal life you just have to be patient and let things just kind of emerge and evolve, and then good things will pop out. Versus if you have everything planned to the last second, that means and you stick to that plan. That means at the moment you planned, you would have had to known how everything was going to go, and it's just impossible to do. So I think it could be cool to think through, like how that's applied to our lives. Um, I mean, a very like small example for me is just like when traveling, I think it's easy to try to plan single thing you're going to do throughout the day because you want to do as many things as possible. But I feel like most people, when they have like good travel stories, it's because they were just open to the randomness of where they were traveling, and something crazy happens to them. They meet someone really interesting, or they, stumble into a restaurant or a neighborhood that they never even heard of, and like they get a really interesting perspective, and I think that's an example of you know not having everything planned out. Things emerge naturally, better than they could have.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking, it would be cool to talk about kind of how this applies because, none of us are planning any cities anytime soon, but yeah, the ideas are really universal. It's something I think about a lot, and I'm sure someone's written about this and, has a catchphrase for it, but just kind of the difference of, and I think I've talked about on this podcast, but like the difference of kind of like making something happen or trying to like add something to your life or to the situation as opposed to like letting something happen, which is often kind of like removing. It's kind of the negative space of it. That I think that's exactly what that's exactly what we're talking about with cities, right? It's like you can kind of this fucking corporate guy, Robert Moses, tries to come and like stick his dick in the middle of Greenwich Village and like fuck everything up, but
Yeah.
but instead it's like no, you don't need to do anything. Like it's also funny too. This is different, but how that's a Chinese idea, and it's kind of the idea of like our economy ideally is a free market where you're letting things happen. But I know all of us kind of agree on this, but with our government often tries to kind of like add something or make something happen, fix something. But I don't know, humans are pretty like resilient and adaptable. And yeah, and I think in our own lives, like to remember that we can adapt and change is a good thing to like to keep in mind, um I don't know, I'm kind of rambling right now, but yeah.
I think you just brought up an interesting, maybe not a contradiction, but at least on the surface a contradiction. So the idea of wu wei being a Chinese ideal and saying, live and let things happen, let solutions emerge organically. I mean, if you look at the most flagrant examples of top-down planning. They're the Great Leap Forward in China and the Soviet Union, right? So it's interesting how Wu Wei comes as a Chinese proverb, because my guess is it applies to the individual. In other words, don't try to solve all your own shit. Don't try to get forward as an individual. Focus on like the collective goals and let Big Papa take care of the plan, right? There's a plan. Just sit back and let the plan unroll itself.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you look back at the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, like Mao's whole shtick was to suppress individual contributions, like suppress the cooperation of the intellectuals. And we're going to focus on these agrarian quotas and these goals and the empowerment of the little guy. And that didn't work. And the Soviet Union tried to do the same thing. They socialized everything. They gave you healthcare in theory, housing. Everyone had food rations. All the jobs were provided solely by the government. There wasn't really a private sector. That failed. It eroded. When you see time and time again these things not really working all that well, there's sort of an interesting, I think like a lot of these order without design conversations are interesting in the concept or in the context of military strategy. So I was reading about this Prussian military strategy called Auftragstaktik, and it basically says that if you're a general, you can go about achieving a mission, a goal, two ways. You can tell your troops what the goal is and how to execute it, right, top down, or you can tell your troops what the goal is and let them come up with the idea of how to execute it. And or taking a step back, you can give them a broad goal, such as like, we're trying to win this war, right? And let them decide the micro goals. That's Auftragstaktik. The idea being you provide them a base of resources, like a protocol layer, which is robust training and like the physical resources necessary to achieve something. So in the context of a city, this would be a body of law, law enforcement, public transport, and delineation of public and private lands. And then you sit back and you let the agents do their thing. And as you'll see, a lot of the most successful commanders in military history have taken this approach. Some haven't, like Napoleon was a very top-down lad. But if you look at like how Mao fought the nationalists in China when he pre-Great Leap Forward, this is what he did, right? He gave his soldiers this idea that here's what we're going to do. We're going to do guerrilla warfare. We're going to isolate the nationalists, and then we're going to attack relentlessly. And then they did their thing, and these things sort of work out organically. So I think there's, like, getting back to levers, right? This order without design idea, it crops up very predictably and successfully, like across domains. There's a consilience here.
Yeah, it's actually interesting, and I mean, Amazon's essentially like a giant country or military, but except they're peaceful. But I guess it depends who you ask. But they essentially tried to do the same thing where they have like the idea of a single threaded owner, and teams have charters. And the idea is that, they want to push down control to each local team and local division, such that at the top, like, there's no one at the top that has to plan everything, right? And that's part of the reason why you can see Amazon enter so many businesses, because they're part of the ethos of the company is to push command down. What's interesting in practice, when you start getting a company really big and it's growing really fast, it's hard to actually enforce that. So even though like you can speak to this idea of like local control and versus command from the top, it's harder in practice. So Alexa grew to be a giant organization really fast, and it kind of moved away from that. So there was like the directors and the engineers at top were trying to plan everything for like 1,000-person organization, and that ends up just stalling progress. So what's one reason why this kind of pushing control down locally is really important. It's because otherwise the person at the top becomes the bottleneck on all decision making, right? And that's a really brittle system. And so actually, I've heard a lot of managers say like their job as a manager is to be such that if they left, everything would keep running, which uh, is is pretty interesting, right? Because I think when people first ever start as a manager, they're like micromanagers and they're checking everything, all of their employees' work, and they feel like they're responsible for everything. And then you have like the sage managers who've been at it for a while, and
Yeah.
they're like, I need to go on vacation for a month to make sure you guys know what's going on, which which means they're simultaneously working less and doing a better job, which is and that is a lever. But
Yeah. It's interesting, dude. I was gonna bring that. I was gonna ask you guys about your experience in the business world with like top down versus bottom up. I think I've had bosses who want like they in their head they think that they're top down, but they're definitely not. Or sorry, they think they're cultivating like a bottom up kind of system, but they are top down. Um, and definitely I think the best people like they do a really good job hiring, and then they put people in position. That's kind of how my job is right now. I think my new job, it's like they give me a lot of freedom, and they're kind of like, you can come to us if you have questions, but like go fucking figure it out, trial by fire shit. And if I like don't show initiative and I'm just lazy, like they'll just fire me and try to hire somebody else really good. Whereas my last job, it was, which I liked my last job, but it was very much like, hey, we're going to be with you every step of the way. And this is exactly how you do, this is the formula, um, which I prefer the more bottom up approach right now. That's how my like the CTO is. He's not involved in the day to day at all, but he's like, here's what we're doing. We're trying to 10x our revenue. That's the goal. Like, you guys figure out what your part in that is.
the harder the problems you're working on, and the more difficult the situation, the better the bottom up works. Because if it's top down, you're just bottlenecked to the person who's coming up with all the commands, right? Um, so if you know
Big
exact
Papa.
Yeah, if you know exactly what you're supposed to do and it's all already been solved, then it's better just to like treat people like robots and tell them exactly what to do. But if there's uncertainty, like you don't know how to get to 10x revenue, then you want all your employees, like channeling all their brain power and having them all trying to figure it out. Um, and I think that's kind of why you see this, you know, bottom up growth. Like you don't see growth from top down control, right? Because it's not very adaptive. You have the plan and they just issue it to the people and try to enforce it, and there's no room for creativity. But if you know the solution to a problem, like the top down control can work really well because it's very efficient. It's like just do this thing, and if you've already mastered the problem, then it's good. The issue is when you're the environment is less certain or something changes. That's when top down control kind of becomes super brittle, which is
Yeah.
is more the rule than the exception. But
I think that's an interesting extension of the top down versus bottom up conversation. If you think about organisms or warring soldier bases, like once you start planning, that assumes a certain size and like rigidity, and like Chris said, like rigidity begets um, brittleness pretty much immediately. So what you end up doing is when you're a certain size and you've built up all these resources, you end up hardening and protecting and then trying to crowd out. So what your moat becomes is like your pure mass and trying to monopolize and exploit the underlying cash flows or whatever resource you're trying to exploit, right? If you're a huge military, you use your military size to invade areas and then crowd out the territory's inhabitants. But what the bottom up does is it gives you resilience, your power comes from a different place. Your power comes from you being amorphous in a way and being able to adapt to circumstances and grab opportunities as they come. And what that means is if you're amorphous like that, your defense against competitors, your moat, isn't so much like the bulwarks, the walls you build around, but your very maneuverability is almost impossible to place. And it allows you to solve problems so much more quickly and hunt down like lines of inquiry and business lines so much more quickly. Like early Amazon, we're talking about Amazon. Like the culture was, Bezos made a few good decisions and then he allowed interest groups to go hunt down lines of inquiry and business lines. And there was a ton of failure. The vast majority of everything was failure. But AWS came out of that, right? And then when you have AWS, which is an immensely profitable business, then you can blitz scale on commerce. You can take losses on commerce, right? And it was that amorphous maneuverability early on that ultimately made it into this thing that it's now kind of trapped. I mean, I imagine Amazon will continue to innovate, but it's sort of on that precipice of innovator's dilemma where it has these cash cows and it's built this hierarchy, this great big thing. And it looks like in some ways it's going to, exclusionary moat mode as opposed to amorphous building mode. But it's kind of a natural progression of all things, cities, companies, biological organisms.
I'm reminded of I saw this interview with Dan Held, who's like a heavy Bitcoin maximalist, but he I think he was head of growth or something at Uber, and he talked about how Uber's culture, it had like they really valued people kind of trying to like in the corporate hierarchy, they wanted people underneath to like challenge their bosses, challenge their managers. Like it was a big part of it. Like you got props if you like proved your manager was wrong and got a better idea. And I was just Googling it. So one of their like, little models is we value ideas over hierarchy. And he was saying like, it's actually true. A lot of companies will say this is the culture and it's not, but he was like, no, that's actually true. Like they really wanted people to challenge each other. And I think in the case of Uber, I don't know the history of Uber Eats, but I read an article recently and I just pulled it up that Uber Eats has like double the revenue now of the Uber mobility. So like the ride sharing and stuff. And I would imagine that Uber Eats was kind of, it was like a, it was probably something that was kind of disruptive and somebody brought up like, hey, let's do this. It probably sounded crazy at the time, but then you look at it and it's like, oh, wow, well now they're making double the revenue. And same with AWS, right? It's like, what was Amazon, an online bookstore at one point? And now they're providing, cloud infrastructure for like the government and every, Fortune 500. It's pretty cool. It's being agile.
The Uber example is an interesting one. I didn't really know about the very iterative experimental culture of the company. I mean, it makes sense. It was a successful Web 2.0 company. It's got to have some elements of that in the early days. What I do know about Uber, though, which may be more ably, or it enables them to have that experimental culture, is early on, Uber did not try to build out its infrastructural elements. It outsourced those to specialists. So, it didn't try to build out its own payment APIs and payment structures. It outsourced that to Stripe. It didn't try to build out its own GPS. It outsourced that to Google Maps. It didn't try to build out its own cloud. It outsourced that to AWS. Right? It had the protocol layer. It had the base resources such that it could go try to specialize in these lines of inquiry. And I think only if you have those like very basic building blocks that you can recombine, that you can build on top of, does it enable you at all to have that experimental type of culture, which ends up allowing you to specialize. So like Amazon, AWS, and e-commerce, Uber Eats, and then ride sharing. Only with those basic building blocks, which again, you see across the board, right? Auftragtaktik in military. You see like rule of law and public transport in cities. Like just provide this and then let the people or the groups do their thing. I think it's a constant pattern.
Yeah, I think an interesting thing then, like relating that to personal life, is okay, you don't want to overplan. and because then that crowds out like the spontaneity and kind of the emergence of, like value in your life, but you have to plan. It's like kind of paradoxical, right? And I'm kind of dealing with this in my life right now because I'm unemployed and, figuring out what to do, and everyone's asking you what are you doing every day every day, and I don't have a good answer. Um, and so then you get like anxious, like, oh, am I not doing anything, right? Uh, and so like, should I go get another job right now because I'm not doing anything? But once I get another job, that locks me into something that, might not be what's best for me. And so I need to be patient, and but you know, I still need to be doing something each day while I wait for like kind of the things to evolve around me. And I guess what I think about there is like, okay, what are the invariants that I should invest in while I'm waiting for everything to evolve around me? And that invariants are, the thing that uh, no matter which way life goes, for the next year, the 100 different ways it could go, I'm going to be happy that I spent today doing that thing, because any different plan, it'll end up being valuable. So for me right now, that's, working on coding and Ethereum development and just reading about things I'm interested in. But I think that's kind of my kind of view is, planning doesn't work. There could be 100,000 different plans going forward, but I still need to plan. So knowing that, what should I do? Try to invest in the invariants that are going to be useful in any case, which is kind of what like a state or a big company should do, right? Like they don't know exactly what's going to happen, but they can't just go to their, can go to their shareholders and be like, we don't know what's going to happen. We'll find out, right? Like it's kind of the interesting dilemma of being limited in our planning ability. So, um, but I think that's the best strategy.
I was raised very much in a way to try to look as far forward as possible and plan things out on a very granular basis, which I think provided a good structure. But as I've gotten older, I mean, I used to plan everything like Chris and Shake from back in the day. I imagine you got a taste of it as well. I liked everything to be neat. I liked to be able to expect an outcome and that outcome to happen. It didn't always happen, but planning is done very well for my family, and so something that I've tried to revise going into proper adulthood is knowing when the planning should stop, knowing what you should plan for. There are certain things that simply must be planned in advance because they're huge advantages, and other things where if you over plan and you don't build, I mean, you can plan randomness. I think that's what's key. Like you can focus on some of the invariants, and you should build randomness into your life in sort of a predictable way. So, for example, when I was working, everything was very, very planned. I would go to my office every day. I would get there at 8. I would leave at 7. I would get my paycheck. I would get drunk on the weekends, read on Sundays, and it was day in, day out, sort of the same shit. Everything was secure. Everything was planned. When I quit, everything was completely insecure. I decided to move to Turkey. Instead of reaching out to people, trying to find some stopgap job, reach out to the various connections I might have had, I decided to lean into some sort of the randomness and iterative nature of life. I got over there and things just sort of fall into place, right? You end up like building new strategies, new ways of navigating life in a new place, just like you would anywhere, right? You end up adapting and evolving and meeting people. I would go to the same coffee shop because people were good to me there. I would meet some Americans there. I ended up meeting a bunch of Turks who knew the Americans. This one random Turk I met, right? I was doing some personal training and I decided I needed a scooter. So I bought a scooter in Turkey. Bought a scooter. I was 45 minutes off the mainland, sitting in this used motorcycle warehouse with these bunch of Turks, didn't speak a word of English. We're all sipping tea. And we had settled on a price. Somehow I'd negotiated a price for this colossal scooter, like 250 cc's, which is gonna be my little like mobile node to do my personal training to make some money, which again was like complete order without design. I was hoping I'd be able to train people, and Swift wasn't allowing my money to go through. It was like middle of the night back in the States, so I couldn't call my parents. So I was just sitting in this warehouse drinking tea, couldn't get money. And this lad, who was like this Turkish dude who had started a bunch of businesses in Turkey. I'd met him twice. I reached out to him. He was the last resort. There's no one else you reach out to in this context. You just have an intuition that a person might be able to help. And on the spot, he wired me $3,500 to give to these Turkish guys for the motorcycle so I could get back to the mainland. And then I had my scooter and I went back to the mainland. I ended up building a whole bunch of client bases so I could travel to only if I had the scooter, right? So this was like a pretty wild thing for me to dive in head first into this uncertainty. But what ends up happening is you figure it out, right? Like you adapt to the circumstances. And had you wound life back all the way to the beginning and tried to plan it all out, like the quality of life and like the enrichment probably would have been much, much lower. So I think there is a balance to be struck. Like you got to plan certain things, but if you leave room for randomness, like really great things can happen, which is something that I've had to learn firsthand to really realize that you sometimes need to take your foot off the planning gas pedal.
That is a fucking amazing story. You told that story really well, and it honestly reminds me a lot of when I was studying abroad. Just like being in these situations where you're like, how the fuck did I get here, and what's gonna happen? But yeah, a lot of times it's like the most, I don't know, it's the most growth, or the most like, I don't know, sometimes the most beautiful things can come out of these like completely random serendipitous times. I liked what Chris said earlier too about planning a vacation. I think it's actually something there's some thing in psychology about this, but yeah, when you have expectations over specifically like a holiday or a trip and you plan it out, you're less happy than when you just go and kind of make the best of it, just like what you did in Turkey.
So what's kind of funny about Turkey is like that was my first proper foray into like true experimental survival, and I was doing it in a country that like could not be more top-down autocratic.
And didn't you end up in Turkey? Can you explain why you ended up in Turkey too, specifically?
Oh yeah, it's very simple. So I quit my job and I wanted to go travel for a bit. I really wanted to work in VC in Europe, and so I was convinced that I could fly into a country that bordered the EU and then slither through the border. Turkey was one of like 9 countries in the world that I could go as an American, like Serbia and like Belarus were some of the other ones, Korea. So I was going to go to Turkey. I was going to get up to the border and probably scoot through it or figure out a way to get through it. I was convinced I could do it, and then it wasn't happening. So after 89 days on a 90-day tourist visa, I decided to put my tail between my legs and head back to the home ground.
It's amazing. I have a similar I don't know how similar it is, but when I was in Brazil, I just didn't know anybody, and when I decided to go there too, it was completely intuition. I was deciding to go to like some place in the Netherlands where they spoke English, or I don't know, I think there was some Dutch, whatever. But I was deciding between going to the Netherlands and Brazil. And like everything in my head was like, it makes more sense for me to go to the Netherlands. Like I'll fit in there, like I'll be able to speak the language and whatever. And I don't know, it's kind of this thing that I think my parents instilled in me was like seek out like change, like seek out like new experiences. So I just decided like, fuck it, I'm gonna go to Brazil and I'm gonna learn a new language, And when I went there, I was with a lot of exchange students, and they tended to hang out with each other, and they would like go clubbing and go to nice restaurants, and they would all speak English because they're all American and some Europeans, but yeah, everyone would speak English. And I I didn't have money to do that, first of all. And I also was like, why would I come here and like hang out with all these like students from Penn? You know what I mean? Like that's just like, I might as well stay at WashU if I was going to do that. So I was really like driven to like, I want to meet Brazilian people and like do Brazilian things, and I had started skateboarding the summer before, and I brought my skateboard there, and my Portuguese professor was like, hey, there's a skate park down the street, you should go there. And I don't know, like when you go to skate parks, and at least for me, because I suck at skateboarding, it's kind of like intimidating, right? Like there's all these people like doing sick tricks, and this was in a place where no one was speaking English, and I didn't know anybody, but I just fucking sacked up, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna go there. And it turned out to be like one of the most enriching experiences of my life, because these guys were like, oh, he's American, he's so cool, right? And we started talking, and that's how I learned the language. Was I would like go with them and like skate all day, go get beers. I would had dinner at their houses, met their parents and stuff, and then I also like they taught me how to do some tricks, and it's like still to this day, it's like, skateboarding is it's like part of who I am. Like I love it, and I do it everywhere I go. And it just never would have happened, if I was like, hey, let me like plan this out and like stick in the comfort zone.
Yeah, I remember when you did that. I thought that was so crazy. We were like 20 years old. I was like, this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
By the time TJ did it, we were like a lot older. I was like, I've seen it done before. No offense, TJ. I thought it was cool when you did
I've
it
seen it
too.
done before.
Offense taken. I'll see you guys later.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a lot of paradoxes involved with this stuff, right? Like we're not just saying, oh, it's all bottom up or it's all top down or it's all planning, no planning. You kind of have to intuit a little bit, when it's appropriate. I kind of like, I mean, we're talking order without design. There's also like the chaos order dichotomy, where you want, or order randomness dichotomy, where you want order in some parts of your life and randomness in others. And it's not like, it's a bit of yin and yang, right? You have to walk the middle path. You can't just have some de facto rule like always order, always randomness, 50% order, 50% randomness. It's like, it's always context dependent.
Yeah. Like I think what you said actually brings up how you were talking about, what you look at your daily activities, and it's like, what can I do now to set me up to be where I want to be? It kind of is a top down design. Like, and I think that too, in some ways, where it's like, okay, I'm 26. When I'm 30, like what do I want my life to look like, and what can I do today, and what do I do tomorrow and the next day to get there, right? So I think you're right. I think there's definitely a good balance of, it's not just, oh, bottom up is always the best way to go and just completely chaotic. um it's like this kind of like you got to sway between them. And yeah.
Yeah, there's kind of like, there's the hippie, right, that only lives in the present, does whatever they feel at the moment, which is just complete chaos. Um, and there's something romantic about that. But I think the issue there is, if we're all like, as an individual, if you're always just doing what you want to do in the moment, there's no like, you're less likely to make progress on things, right? And so like one of the things is like Peter Thiel always like is kind of very critical of that mindset, right? Like of just going with the flow all the time. Because if you just go with the flow all the time, you don't really have this idea of progress in mind, and he thinks progress is super important to mankind. So I think that's kind of an interesting, you know, um, idea. Is like, you don't want too much planning because obviously that crowds out the spontaneity. You don't want too much randomness because then you don't make any progress anywhere. It's like a random walk. Um, if you're like if you're on a truly random walk, every moment you either go right, left, up, or down. The most likely place you're going to be is where you started, like mathematically. So uh, it's kind of, you have to find that middle path.
Yeah, go with the flow is just a weak lymph. You want to be fluid, but you want to be constantly trying things. And as soon as you get feedback, successful feedback, you lean into those things. You blitz scale them. And the stuff where you get negative feedback, you abandon. You do that quickly. You're trying to make progress. You're not letting the river just take you down. I mean, you're doing some rowing.
Yeah. It's man, I love where our shows, I love kind of the direction that we go.
It started with the city, but it ends with the
Yeah.
man. Viktor Frankl. Um, I mean, it's just like, I guess I'm always conflicted. Like, I want clear answers, And so I read something in Order Without Design. I'm like, oh, no planning ever again, And
Yeah.
then you read something like Teal, and you're like, oh, I need a life plan. And then da 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 da. And you gotta. What are you gonna say, Teach?
Well, I was just gonna say, like, I do that same thing where, like, I just read Future and Its Enemies, which is like all like pro dynamist, and we read Order Without Design, which is like all pro exploration. But actually, like, I feel like I kind of give short shrift to both the authors, because what they're really saying is that you should only plan those building blocks um, that form the bedrock of whatever basket of initiatives agents want to build on top of them, which I think makes it makes a ton of sense, and it bodes well for a lot of these like universal interoperable crypto protocols, which is like you want to build that bedrock, right? Like that's the part you want to plan. What's so tricky is like where do you stop, right? Like what's the point of planning where the marginal cost exceeds the marginal benefit? Like that's just such a tricky problem that in a lot of ways, like the more practical answer is to just be extreme Order Without Design or go extreme top down, because being in this amorphous state is just tricky. It's tricky for an entity or an organism. But I do think that these authors do give credence to the idea that certain infrastructural elements are required for productive cooperation of economic agents or any agents.
Yeah, I think you. Oh, go ahead, Sam.
I was just gonna say, I was actually gonna bring up because when you had been talking about like the protocol layer, I was gonna bring up Ethereum and kind of, I think it'd be interesting to talk about how you could argue it kind of has elements of both, like Vitalik built this thing with one kind of thing in mind, right? Like it just decentralization is kind of broad, um, this broad, approach, but there's been all these different things built on top of it. Like I don't think he ever thought of DeFi. Maybe I'm wrong about that, right? Has he? Do you guys know? I don't
I
think he
mean,
was like ever had finance in mind when he built Ethereum necessarily.
I think he
My-
kind of
my-
had like inklings of it, but yeah, there's no way he knew all this was going to happen.
Yeah, but then parts of it, it is kind of top down, because even though it's decentralized, like I think a lot of people who build things on Ethereum and a lot of people who mine Ethereum, like they listen to Vitalik in one way or another. Like he's kind of like the boss of Ethereum. Um, Whereas, if we compare it to Bitcoin, like it's just, pseudonymous Satoshi who isn't publicly like writing Medium articles or anything.
Yeah, a lot of times in software, your goal, like you're the engineer, and at your level, you're trying to plan your level, and then what you want is you want to provide building blocks or components that then someone else can put together in novel ways that you didn't expect. So that's where like composability comes in. That was a big thing for AWS. They wanted to build primitives, and then they can let app developers, so they provide storage and compute, and then app developers can come in and mix it up in all types of way. And what happens? Uber pops out, and Airbnb pops out. And so you kind of see this reoccurring pattern where um, the exploration happens on the fringes or on the frontier, and then the layer below the frontier, there was the iteration before there was exploration that arrived at a useful pattern that gets locked in, and then the exploration happens at the level above. So with Ethereum, they came in, they lock in like this idea of how the smart contracts and objects will communicate, and then DeFi and NFTs start getting built on top of it. For the city, in Order Without Design, they're saying, the grid structure works really well. So lock in a grid structure, lock in, certain like public transport, and then let everything happen at like the layer above, and let like your job is just to give this nice platform, and then let the exploration and discovery happen on top of you, which I think is kind of an interesting thing. And at the societal level, like once you have a certain thing, like a certain problem figured out, you kind of lock that in, and then the process of discovery reoccurs at the next level up.
I mean, I think what's neat about all of these crypto protocols is ultimately, like, it all gets abstracted away, but ultimately the protocols are sets of rules that incentivize productive behavior amongst economic agents or amongst agents, right? And so if you provide those building blocks, like Chris was saying, that can be combined, and you have like these like Pigouvian taxes built in to dissuade people from doing bad, dumb shit and to incentivize them to do good stuff. If you created that system, a robust incentive system, as long as you have that, it allows people to iterate and tinker in ways that are far more scalable than they've ever been before. I mean, the city is there to create a legal and enforcement mechanism and create infrastructure for people to combine, right? But all the people that benefit from those structures have to be proximate to that city. What crypto is building, or certain protocols are building, whether it's Solana or EVM or whatever else, is they've built like one set of truth, one set of incentives for people to build on top of. And there's these certain like infrastructural layers that sort of like in the Uber example that are unrolling themselves. And in combination, it just makes the entire ecosystem more composable. For example, you have EVM, that's like a security layer. That's a secure smart contract layer that incentivizes people to cooperate and agree on a state of truth. That's a security layer. That's sort of like a law enforcement layer. You have the Oracle layer, basically saying like good data is entering the system for these developers to recombine on top of the security layer. Then you have like the actual security layer, which is like decentralized storage, ensuring that a single file is stored redundantly across time and space. Like these are the building blocks that they're not really top-down planning, right? Because you're just building the very base for people to iterate on top of. Like you need this stuff though. That's key. That's like where planning comes in, I think. You need to build those good systems at the bottom.
Yeah. This is kind of related, but I've heard art students talk about how it's easier to be creative sometimes, like in the context of a class and like an assignment, as opposed to just like a completely blank canvas and no direction, like some kind of minimal structure of this is what your art's going to be. It can be easier to like build on top of that.
Yeah, they say it all the time in engineering, like necessity is the mother of all invention or something like that. Basically, which then they'll use to basically give a team less resources and money at Amazon, so that it'll be like, oh, this will make you more inventive. But I think that is true. Like the more constraints you have, it limits delimits the search space for ideas. So at Amazon, like if we had like one end-to-end product we had to build or use case, we would have just built that exactly. But then if they gave us like 5 of them, actually what happened? So in 2020, we had like a bunch of different goals to hit, and we needed to build all these different systems. Instead of building one system for each, we built like a series of components that then we could recombine to basically solve every use case. And so by giving all those different constraints, like you need to fulfill 5 different use cases, let's actually build like a minimum set of components that lets us get all these 5 use cases. And then potentially, when the big boss comes down and be like, you need to do this shit too, we could be like, we could just keep recombining our components to solve everything that the top-down bureaucrat wanted us to build. So that was our strategy. And then, yeah. Then my boss would be like, what's your vision for the team? I was like, well, we're just building these set of like core, knowledge graph components. So no matter what the bureaucrats tell us to do, we could just solve it. We could get it done really quickly. And then he didn't really like that.
Have you? I'm curious, Chris. Are you like involved in any way with an Ethereum development community? Like I don't know, forums or Telegram channels, anything like?
Not right now. I'm not like I'm in Discords where I kind of use them to search up like answers to questions I have personally, but I haven't answered anyone else's question. And then in these communities or Discord channels. But they're super interesting. They kind of, I mean, the way it worked at Amazon is we had our Slack and we would all be talking about, how things worked and how to fix things. And it was all proprietary, obviously. And then the Discord channels kind of just mirror that, but it's all out in the open, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah, because as you continue this journey of learning Solidity and everything, like I'd be curious how that what how how it compares with your experience being a developer at Amazon.
hmm It kind of, I mean, it's similar in the sense that, and this is the cool part about all the Ethereum development, it's all open source. So if you're curious about how something works, you can go read the code because it's all on GitHub, and you could potentially just go into whoever wrote that code's GitHub or whoever wrote that code. You could go into their Discord and ask them. People are busy, so it's not like they're always gonna be, oh yeah, let me answer your questions. And you obviously feel bad. Just you're not gonna try. You're not gonna ping Vitalik like, yo, how does this work? But it's all out in the open. So
Dude, looking into someone's GitHub is kind of like lobotomizing someone else. Like you can look inside their brain.
yeah, it's so cool. Like you realize, how does this work? You can literally just go read the blueprint.
I mean, it's unreal.
um,
Cool. Anything else you guys want to any closing thoughts?
Nah, bro. I'm about to go do some sun maxing after this, though. That's a closing thought.
I'd say invest in invariance. That's my takeaway from this. We must plan.
I like that. Did you just come up with that?
No, I've thought about it before.
Invest in invariance.
Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you to everyone listening, and we'll see you on the next one.